Many people have the perception that a conflict exists between science and the Christian faith. They argue that the latest scientific advances make belief in God unreasonable and render the biblical creation accounts unbelievable. But is this the case? To help address this question, I am joined by Dr. Kevin Birdwell, a Christian and a scientist. Dr. Birdwell, what do you say to someone who claims that there's a conflict between the two?
Well, I think first you have to understand what you mean by science and what you mean by Christianity. Science is man's attempt to interpret the record of nature. And so, as such, it may be able to tell us a lot of great things, but it is prone to some error because it is an interpretation of humans. The same is true with various Christian faiths. If you're a Christian, you generally believe that the Scripture is inerrant. So that's our standard. But our view of different doctrines, let's say, may vary. And so we're trying to hone in on the truth. So there's some room for error there, again, just like there is with science. And so we have to be clear when we're comparing science and Christianity that we're talking on the same page, basically. Also, the underpinnings of the philosophy of science is something that we have to consider. Is it better to do science from a Christian worldview, or is it better to do science from, say, a naturalistic worldview? This is an area that I've always felt was a bit of a quandary for science, at least as it's sometimes practiced today, is because it's often presented in say, a naturalistic or maybe even sometimes an atheistic worldview. But in that worldview, you don't really have an underpinning on which to base it. You have science is based on the assumption that the laws of physics are constant. And why is that? Why, it doesn't really answer that question. I've heard people say, well, maybe it's just because it works, but I've never found that very satisfactory. Whereas in a Christian worldview, you have a single creator who has a consistent character and nature. And at least for me, that makes more sense to base science on, because there you have an understanding of why are the laws of physics the way they are.
Now, how do you yourself practice as a scientist? You work for a lab.
Mm-hmm.
How do you practice your science, and how do you integrate your faith? How do you do the two?
Well, again, I think the Christian worldview informs that, because if you want science to work, it has to work with integrity, with honesty, with humility, with respect for the data, respect for other people's work, and so on. And all of those things I see as essentially Christian values that stem from God's character. And there are I know many scientists who are not Christians who operate with the highest level of integrity. But I think there's really a better way to ground that if you're coming at it from a Christian worldview.